Hey guys, in this podcast we talk about different health topics. As we are not medical experts, we'd ask for you to check with your doctor first before using any information provided in this podcast. Furthermore, we talk about third-party views in this podcast. Please know that we have no intention of misrepresenting these views, and we apologize in advance if we do so. Thanks.
Hey guys, what's up? Today we're going to jump into some philosophy of the mind, and I'm going to explain to you what I think is the most compelling argument for the existence of God. So if you thought the other arguments are hard, this is going to be a hard one to explain for me.
Okay.
So let's just jump into the philosophy of the mind. So
Okay.
what are philosophers of the mind trying to discover? Well, they're trying to discover, one thing in particular they're trying to discover is like how does content affect actual actions?
Okay.
And so basically, like when you have a thought, does that thought cause your action, or does the action cause the thought? So that is like a question they would ask. Philosophers of the mind are also concerned with consciousness. Like why have we evolved this ability to be conscious? Is there an evolutionary advantage to this consciousness that we experience? So that's where Alvin Plantinga comes in with his argument called the evolutionary argument against naturalism. Okay. So let me break down a couple of these things first. Yeah. So evolutionary is simple. It's just the process of evolution, like an animal evolving through micro or macro evolution to get to some stage. That's simple. So what's naturalism though? Naturalism is the idea that everything has come to be through the laws of nature.
Okay, so only the four forces of physics are responsible for everything.
You wouldn't limit to just like Newtonian physics. It would encompass any physical laws that we have determined.
Those are the only game players that turn out to be.
And another thing that believing in naturalism implies is that you believe in a logical sequence of evolution.
Okay.
So you start out with a small single-cell organism, and it has to have logical steps from one sequence to the other. Now, realize that you would also argue that the mutations are spontaneous and random, meaning that they don't happen as a result of the species needing a capability. They just happen, and then if it is successful in helping the animal survive, then it sticks when other ones don't stick. So that's what naturalism is, and that's what evolution is. So what is Alvin Plantinga trying to say? Alvin Plantinga is trying to say that evolution is incompatible with naturalism.
Wow. Now you think the opposite. You would think evolution came from naturalism.
Yeah, you would think that.
Okay. Because you would think that all these laws of physics, or all these, fundamental equations would allow you to explain why evolution works, and then from evolution you explain how we got here.
Mm-hmm, exactly.
But you're saying, actually, evolution is contradicted by naturalism.
Naturalism, yeah.
Wow,
now this is going to be really interesting. So
okay.
Let me just go a little bit into philosophy of the mind and talk about some main schools of thought. So there's something called epiphenomenalism. Now epiphenomenalism is the idea that our thoughts and beliefs, the content of our thoughts and beliefs, have no effect on our actions whatsoever. Okay?
Oh, okay.
So it means that we do an action, and a byproduct of doing that action is a thought. Now, an interesting thing to note about this type of thinking is that this type of thinking is what drove the behaviorist psychology movement in the early 1930s and onward.
Okay. Can we get an example? So, let's say I want to pick up my cup here.
Yeah.
So you're saying,
you pick up the cup, the neural properties necessary to pick up the cup occur, and then your thoughts are a byproduct of it. So your neural properties.
I have to think first to pick up the cup,
yeah,
right?
So but what you're arguing is that your thoughts do not have control over your actions. That is the argument. And there were certain studies done that seemed to suggest that maybe our thoughts of doing something were delayed before the neural properties have. So no, I'm not arguing for epiphenomenalism. I think it's wrong, and I don't think many people argue for it anymore.
Okay.
But like B.F. Skinner and some other psychologists, like the heads of the behaviorist movement, wanted to show that our thoughts were also note that they wanted to explain psychology by means of things that were empirical and real, not through the mind. So they wanted to discount the mind and its influence in behavior, and they wanted to look at only things that we could see actionable effects from.
Huh. Okay. So like a simple reflex, for example.
So let's say you're going to the doctor, you decide you're going to the doctor. They want to eliminate thought from the process as a reason for going to the doctor, and say that there was neural properties that cause you to want to go to the doctor. Okay. Mm-hmm. That's not a great example. So I apologize, but that was just something I came up with on the spot. But then you hit the cognitive era of the 1950s.
Okay.
And a lot of it came as a result of experiments.
Okay.
So I think it was B.F. Skinner. I might be wrong. He wanted to prove that this epiphenomenalism was true. And he was convinced that he could.
Your actions produce, like, thought is a byproduct of actions.
You're right. So he wanted to prove it. And he wanted to prove behaviorism to be true. So he did this.
Behaviorism is what? I'm sorry.
Oh, it's the same thing. It's just an applied psychology version of epiphenomenalism.
Okay. So just to clarify, you're saying you do an action, and then the action actually produces a thought from that action. Mm-hmm. Wow.
Well, actually, another thing that I should mention is that the thought is irrelevant to the action being done.
What? Okay.
So a thought is basically an illusion.
Wow. Okay, but why would you even have a thought in the first place then? If
right, and that's one of the problems that epiphenomenalists have to answer is like, why do we even have thoughts if they have no value over our actions?
Yeah. Okay.
So it's the idea that they are just byproducts of the neural properties completing it, and that they don't really have much influence on. They don't have any influence actually. Epiphenomenalism says they don't have any influence on the actions that we do.
But I mean, to me, it just sounds so like, how could you ever think that? Because like, if I want like a glass of water, for example, I think, oh, well, I have to grab a cup for a glass of water.
Yeah.
So
it's very counterintuitive.
Yeah.
And I think the reason why people believed it was because of some research that came out that may have been flawed, because I think that there are times where an action is, the mechanisms to complete the actions are performed and the thoughts follow, are slightly delayed. And I think that that research pointed towards this perspective. But this perspective is not really used much anymore, and I'll explain like a modern version of it that is more common.
Okay.
So I was saying that B.F. Skinner wanted to do an experiment to prove behaviorism, which I'm saying is an applied version of epiphenomenalism.
Okay.
And so at the time, like early 1930s, they started working with the brain and realizing that they could like send signals into the brain to cause someone to move a certain part of their body.
Right.
So he wanted to prove that the thought process wasn't necessary. All that was necessary was the neural properties being activated in order for someone to do an action.
Oh, okay. I get what you're saying. All right. Let me kind of jump in with a little science thing here. Okay. So there's different types of nerve arrangements, I want to say, how your neurons are arranged. For example, we have like our sensory nerves and we have our motor nerves. So if you take someone's motor nerves for like their fingers, for example, and you stimulate them up here because the nerves travel down throughout the hand, you can make their finger twitch without them controlling it because you're stimulating their nerve. So the idea is if you're in the brain and you go to their motor cortex and stimulate the motor cortex, you could stimulate their finger and you bypass the thought process of it.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Exactly. And so that's what he did is, he learned that like, you send an electrode through a part of the brain and you can get their finger to move or something like that.
Yeah.
But he actually completely took back his theory and said that he was wrong because what he was trying to prove was incorrect, because what would happen is, sure, he'd send an electrode through and they would perform the action, but the person was able to differentiate when they chose to do it and when he caused it to happen.
Wow. Okay, so they could see like their finger was moving and
but they're like they were not the cause of it.
Wow.
And so that brings up a big question to whether content supervenes actions or whether it is reducible to neural properties. And I want to explain that a little bit more.
Okay.
In a later thing, and like as we go down, I'm going through like a little bit of a background, so so people can hopefully understand this argument.
Yeah, this is a huge argument, so try to stick with it.
And also remember that this is like I have not studied this for like 20 years, and there's people out there who have. And if you're listening, well, I'm just saying like there's people out there who their whole life has been dedicated to this research. I've studied this stuff for like a month at most.
Oh, okay.
So I could be wrong, and if you're like actually a neuro philosopher or like philosopher of the mind, you probably are going to be mad if you listen to this. I probably am wrong in a couple of areas.
Okay.
But I'm getting hopefully the main ideas right, and I'm getting his argument right. I'm hoping.
Okay.
So today, like a more modern version of the epiphenomenalism is epiphenomenalism semantic theory.
Okay.
Semantics just refers to meaning.
Okay.
And this theory proposes that our thoughts and beliefs are not causes of our actions, but that they have long-term consequences. Like they have a long-term effect on actions.
On future actions.
Like they're there and they have a somewhat of an influence on the actions, but they're not the cause of it. And that they're linked to long-term.
So they have the actual origin of the action is different, but the action itself has been influenced slightly by our thought.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so this is a belief that is held by a lot of people. They're saying like, okay, we're not going to say that belief and thought have no power. We're just going to say it's it's a different power and they don't have that much power.
Okay.
So I don't want to spend too much time on that because I've already kind of explained epiphenomenalism. So if you understand that, you should understand the semantic version. So the next sort of theory is that beliefs are efficacious to actions, but they're maladaptive to the environment.
In English.
Okay. Okay. So what that means basically is that your thoughts and beliefs, it's a very similar theory to the epiphenomenalism that I was discussing before.
Okay.
Except for now we're saying like if your beliefs your beliefs are efficacious to your actions. Okay.
So when
So
you say
they're
efficacious,
positive. They're good for.
Okay.
They have an effect. They're good for.
okay.
They aid in an action,
Okay.
but they're maladaptive. And maladaptive just means that they've adapted poorly. They adapt poorly to an environment. So basically, what I'm saying is that your thoughts affect your actions, but they're not very
They're not
adaptive
very,
and effective.
yeah, they're not very good. They're not very. You wouldn't want them to affect your actions because they're maladaptive.
Yeah.
And they don't like if the environment or situation changes, your thoughts don't normally change as well to
Right.
the environment.
Exactly.
Okay.
So that's an additional theory, and then you have sort of the last theory that your thoughts are efficacious towards your actions and adaptive to your environment.
Okay, so it's just the same thing, but except
Now,
now
instead of maladaptive,
they're adaptive.
they're adaptive.
Okay, so which one is it? The
So
maladaptive and
there's
the
still like a
adaptive?
lot of debate to what it is.
Okay.
We don't really know, but I'm going to talk about how the most accepted model now, and like those are like old theories for the most part, and I want to talk a little bit about what the most accepted theory is, and then how the argument fits into it. So,
Okay.
currently, most neuroscientists believe basically that there's two things. There's two things that we need to understand: content, which we could also call beliefs,
Okay.
and neural properties.
Okay.
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 And what happens is that content affects neural property. Like content somehow affects neural properties. So what a
Okay.
belief somehow affects neural properties.
So like when you say neural properties, you mean like the arrangement of how neurons are placed in their organization, right?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So why don't we
Let
break
me-
that down a little bit? So
let me-
like
yeah.
basically, whenever you do an action,
Yeah.
it has content that is linked to the action. So
Yes.
you have a system and a pattern of neurons.
Yeah.
And that is linked to a certain action.
Yeah, let me maybe break
So
that
yeah,
down. a
why
little
don't you
further.
break that down a little?
Okay, so think of your brain as kind of like a computer, but the problem is in the brain, the software is literally integrated within the hardware. Because the way that your neurons are arranged and connected literally imply an ability to do something. So Paul might have 100 neurons, I might have 100 neurons, and my 100 might be arranged to understanding how the sun works, whereas Paul's 100 neurons might be arranged to figure out like the psychology stuff, okay? The point is that we might have the same neurons, but they've been arranged in a different organization to contain different information.
And then on top of that, talk about like we want to say that we have these patterns of neurons that then cause an action through like a synapse.
Right.
Like it shoots that through, and it's linked to an action too.
Yeah, so from those main 100 neurons, you might generate an action potential or a message, in other words, to actually do a motor action. Okay, so there's different parts of the brain. Like one part like tells the brain, okay, we're gonna fire the hand to move, and all these things. But the bottom line is, me and Paul might have different primary like arrangement of neurons, but for our arms to actually move, the arrangement is literally the same for the arm part at least. Now, if he's a little bit more coordinated, then he'll have more neurons dedicated to it, or maybe my neurons are a little bit sluggish compared to his, or something like that. But the whole point is that I guess I want to say the conscious part of our brains are organized very differently, but the actual motor neurons are kind of the same because they're doing the same action almost.
Yeah.
Learning how to like learning like an actual textbook, like learning how a microphone works, for example, is very, very different than learning how the solar system works. But learning how to swing like a tennis ball or swing a racket in tennis versus how to golf a golf swing, that's much more similar. And so the major difference comes in your primary consciousness and how you actually think your primary thoughts.
Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that's a great explanation. I'm so glad I'm here to like dig a little deeper. So why don't we now get into Planeta's argument? So remember what I said, there's two important things: beliefs / content and neural properties. Okay. So Planeta is trying to say that evolution is incompatible with naturalism. So he assigns different probabilities to naturalism and evolution. So he says the probability of evolution given naturalism. Okay.
Yeah.
So he assigns different probabilities and stuff. I can't tell you off the top of my head, but basically what he's arguing is that the evolutionary process does not have mechanisms to make our beliefs, the content, true, because it's completely unnecessary as a evolved organism for the thoughts to be true. And so he's saying that the content does not matter what the content is. All that matters is the action. And because it doesn't matter what the content is, we have little probability that the content is actually true because evolution lacks a process in order to improve or make it true.
Okay, so let's get an example going on this.
Okay, so let's say you're being hunted. Let's say that there's a guy. His name is Paul, and he wants to be eaten by a lion. Okay.
Okay.
And he wants a lion to eat him. Okay.
Yes.
So he goes and he looks for lions to find that to want to eat him.
Yeah.
Well, every lion that he encounters, he does not think is capable of eating him.
Okay.
So whenever he sees one of these lions, he runs away.
Okay.
So what happened here is that his belief is that he wants a lion to eat him.
Yeah.
But he's surviving. All his body and arms, legs, everything is surviving based on a false belief
That the lion could not eat him.
no, not that the lion couldn't eat him, but that a lion should eat him. So he's still surviving, even though the content and the
Okay.
belief is totally
Let me give maybe another example that's kind of similar. So,
Yeah.
like, for example, let's say, like cheetahs, for example, you believe like cheetahs have evil spirits in them, and as a result, you always stay away from cheetahs.
Yeah.
That happens to be an evolutionary advantage for you because the real reason why you should stay away from cheetahs is because they're much faster than you, and
Yeah.
they'll be able to kill you much more easily.
Yeah.
But regardless, it doesn't matter if they have if you believe they have evil spirits, or if you believe the actual truth that they're faster than you and they'll kill you, because regardless, you're still staying alive.
Right, exactly. And so, because of the fact that we can have different beliefs for the same actions, like we can build a fire, but we could think that building a fire is like telling so and so that we want this food cooked, not that the fire is actually cooking the food. Because the belief can be anything,
Yeah.
it doesn't affect the action. And all that's important for survival is the action that is the byproduct.
The physical action.
The physical action that allows you to survive. And so what the argument says, and I will talk about what follows from it, is that because evolution and our survival needs does not have any mechanism to make these beliefs true, because beliefs don't have to be true.
Yeah, you just
then
need
it's unlikely that the beliefs that we form today are actually reliable. And if the beliefs we form today are not reliable, then anyone who believes that, like epiphenomenalism, cannot believe that, because if by believing it, they also believe that it's improbable
that they believe
that they
the right
actually
thing.
believe the right thing.
Okay, so you're saying we don't need to know the exact fundamental truth.
We don't need to know any truth.
Yeah, we can get like on the surface, maybe up here, or we believe something else, but it ends up leading us to the same action that
Yeah.
if we knew the fundamental truth, we would do.
Yeah.
So you're saying if we derive something that we believe to be true, it probably is not true because our innate mechanisms
Have no way
don't
means
need
of
us to
making it be
to
true.
make true things in the first place.
All they need is for us to survive.
So can I argue then to you that anything that I believe is just probably false? Like,
And
anything
that's the argument that
yeah.
you make, yeah.
Anything. So
That's what the argument's saying.
So you're saying,
But this is saying, given evolution, given naturalism, and this
Oh.
is why evolution and naturalism are incompatible. We're saying is
Okay.
because if they both are true, then your beliefs cannot be reliable because there's no mechanism to make them reliable. And then if both are true, then any belief you hold today is not reliable. But we're saying that they're incompatible. Thus, that must not be the way it is. Evolution is clearly true. But naturalism is incompatible with evolution,
Right.
Because there must have been. So I mentioned earlier the idea of like whether our neural properties supervene an action. So meaning like supervene a belief? Do our beliefs supervene an action? That's what I meant to say. So do our actions is there something beyond our thoughts that causes us to do something, or are they just byproducts of neural properties? So
right.
is there a neural property that then causes us to think that it would be a good idea to then perform this action?
Okay.
And so like when you go to like your fridge to get a beer, there's a lot of assumptions being made. Like you assume that the beer is in your fridge, and so but then you get the idea that I'm going to go up and get the beer. But is that caused because your belief is supervening the action, or because by something a neural? And that's what neuroscience hopes to uncover. Okay.
Oh, okay.
But there's a lot there, and I don't want to get too much more into this argument. But basically,
Yeah.
the general idea is that naturalism is incompatible with evolution,
Right.
because the natural laws have no mechanisms to cause consciousness as we know it to be true. Because
Right.
the consciousness that we know is where a thought and content first comes into being, and then the action follows from that.
Okay. Let me just comment a little bit on this because
Mm-hmm.
I think things are changing today at least, because it seems that the more fundamental your level of truth is, the more advantageous it is for your survival today, not evolutionary times, not like 10 or 20,000 years ago, or even a million years ago. I'm saying today, like if you know, like let's say for example, you're going to be a doctor, okay? If you know the most fundamental truth about a disease, you are more likely to cure it because you know exactly what's causing that disease. another thing too, for example, is if you're a stockbroker and you know the most fundamental laws that drive the economy, you are more likely to predict how the stock market will result, and so you'd have a better idea, a better chance of making more money. So I would argue, there's also the part though that if you make more money, you tend to have less children. So I don't know, but the whole point though is that I think you have a more likely chance of survival if you know the fundamental truth today.
Right.
So there must be. So I just find it like a coincidence that we have this so unique skill of analyzing and figuring out what the fundamental truth is.
Right. But the question you have to ask, is it this skill set of finding truths, which I believe to be perfectly true? Like today we need to know truths in order to excel in society. We could survive, but is it necessary to our survival? And what would cause us to keep developing this skill set when it's unnecessary? And how do we go from the past of having no mechanism to make these beliefs true to now having a mechanism to make them true? And maybe you argue like random mutation and just happen to stumble upon this, but I think that the probability of that is incredibly low. So you have to look at the world given naturalism, given that natural laws cause this process, and you have to say, how does it get from this point to this point where we're at today?
Yeah.
Because the world the way it is today, that's why I'm saying that naturalism must not be true. There must be another alternative, and that is why truth matters and is relevant today. But it's perfectly not necessary for our survival.
Yeah, one thing I wanted just to further your argument is, for us to have the ability to really think and get the fundamental truth on things, we have to use like our frontal part of our brain. Mm-hmm. And if you compare us to other species, our frontal portion of our brain is highly developed. It's much bigger, which means we have to expend a ton of energy to keep that thing running. Mm-hmm. The brain takes up much more energy than any other organ in your body. And so it's like doing double the workload for what would be nothing in this case. Like if you don't need to know a more fundamental truth, what's the point of you having
and
all
this
brain
actually
power?
stems into another like argument for theism, is like, why do we see such a disparity between human intelligence and the intelligence of other species when human intelligence is totally unnecessary for survival?
Yeah, right.
Other species of humans were able to survive, and you'd argue, of course, random mutation and stuff.
Well,
and that's
I mean, if you look at us though, maybe another kind of argument is we don't really have any other mechanism of like hunting or defending. We don't have venom. We don't have sharp teeth. We don't have claws. We don't have fast speed. The only thing, this is another podcast. We have endurance,
which I think is enough to survive.
Yeah, so that's another thing.
But what's also important is like the stuff like building a fire, building a spear to kill an animal is not. It does not follow that the belief or content has to be true in order for you to do that. All that needs to be true is that the neural properties are there in order to make it. You can start a fire and believe that you're doing something entirely differently.
Right, like maybe you're driving away spirits or something.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not trying to shun that area down, but I'm just trying to get another example going. But I guess what I'm trying to say though is, it could be, this is just a theory, it could be that in order to actually build a fire or to build a sphere is actually kind of complicated. Like it takes a lot of I think other species have a difficult time doing it because there's a series of complicated steps that you have to go through. Mm-hmm. And maybe, just maybe, to have the brain power...
Well, I'd say that, first I would say that they're not complicated steps. They're simple steps, but the whole process is complicated.
Yeah, maybe the number of steps is so
and
great.
That's how I'd answer this, is that the human neural properties are capable of doing the actions necessary and build up to get the end result. They can learn through experience. But the belief about the experience is irrelevant to whether they can actually do it.
Right. Okay.
So they learn through experience. So the belief and the content about the experience is irrelevant. What's important is the neural properties that are performing the actions.
Okay.
But so that's basically the argument, and that's a pretty complicated argument. So I suggest if you're interested, you read further on it. But if you want to now go into a different argument that is also very interesting, this is used as modal logic, which is just a a form of logic that came about in the 60s. I could tell you very little about it. Modal logic.
Okay.
I can tell you very little about it because I.
What does it mean? Like, what is modal? Or
modal. I can't remember the term. Like, it has a very clear meaning. I just can't recall it.
Okay.
But this is called the ontological argument. Basically, it was developed by a priest hundreds of years ago.
Okay, so so we're shifting arguments. Like, we're done with the
we're done with the
This is a completely new thing. Okay, sorry.
So, so the ontological argument was developed by a priest. He may have been a Catholic priest, hundreds of years ago. He may have been a Buddhist monk. I'm not entirely sure what he was, but you can look it up if it interests you. And he wanted to prove that God exists with a argument.
Okay.
So he developed this ingenious argument, and when you hear this, it's going to blow your mind.
It's already been blown. But yeah, okay.
Okay, so basically, we need to understand all possible worlds. I've talked about possible worlds in other podcasts.
Okay.
A possible world is any world that could occur that is logical.
Yes.
Okay, logically occur. So
Yeah.
one possible world that we live in is one in which Nick crashed his car last night.
Okay.
Because Nick was driving, and let's say he crashed his car.
Right.
And now all the events that happen as a result of Nick crashing his car now affect reality, and the world's different.
Yeah.
So another world would be like Nick
won the
lottery.
Yeah.
Like he bought a lottery and won the lottery, and that possible worlds that stems from that.
Yeah.
So everything is logical and possibly could happen.
Yeah.
So what is not a possible world? Not possible world is like where illogical stuff happens.
Okay.
Another possible world, by the way, is like a world where cats did not develop whiskers.
Yeah.
So we'd have whiskers that cats that didn't evolve whiskers or something.
Okay. Yeah.
So what's not a logical world? So a not possible world is one in which like married bachelors exist, and I like using this example because I think it's just very clear.
Yeah.
So bachelors can never be married, no matter how things change.
Yeah.
Bachelors will never be married. It just applies to the rules of logic.
Right. Or like, for example, another illogical statement is like we're like carbon-based organisms. We're all carbon-based. You couldn't have like a uranium-based life form because it would just degrade itself.
Yeah. Well, I guess potentially that could be a possible world
if the laws of physics.
If the laws of physics were different, but it doesn't apply the laws of physics. It applies to the laws of logic.
Oh.
A possible world. So
okay.
a world that could be different. A possible world, one in which we're made of plutonium or whatever you said. It's a possible world had like the initial conditions been different. And we evolved differently.
Okay.
But it just depends on the logic. Logic is important to understand.
Okay, so you're just saying impossible worlds are worlds where logic doesn't work. It just doesn't.
Like where something's where something's not true from one world to another.
Okay.
Well, that's such an objective, but sorry.
All right.
Okay. So what this priest wanted to prove is that God existed by definition.
Okay.
By definition alone, God must exist. So you're gonna say, how can you say such a thing?
Yeah.
Okay. So the thing is about God is that God is a maximally great being.
Okay.
And we come to that conclusion.
That's the definition.
We come to that conclusion because of the contingency argument that a necessary maximally great being must exist and created the universe.
Okay.
So we're saying that God is a maximally great, maximally benevolent, maximum whatever being. We don't even have to imply benevolency or anything like that to him. We just have to say God is maximally great.
Okay.
So if God is maximally great, then God must be real. And you gotta say
what?
So if it's possible for God to exist, for a maximally great God to exist, then God must be real. So you're gonna say that doesn't make any sense.
One thing I gotta say, just a disclaimer: we're not necessarily on one side or the other. Like we're not necessarily like religious or not. These are just arguments that we're going over.
Yeah.
Just want to.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Put that out there.
Yeah. So
save my butt.
So
later.
it sounds ridiculous that because if it's possible for a maximally great God to exist, then a maximally great God must exist. So why? So this is where it gets interesting. So in order for a God to be maximally great, he would have to be real, because anything that is not real and not true in all possible worlds is not maximally great, because there's a maximally greater being that exists beyond that. So like we're saying, if God God is maximally great, but he's not real, then he's not really maximally great.
Okay, so
because he's not real. In order for, and so like the arguments for this obviously are like that something doesn't have to be real for it to be maximally great. But this argument is not like my favorite argument or anything. I just find it really funny and interesting.
Okay, so you're just saying that's just kind of ridiculous. So if he's maximally great, then there's nothing that could be above him, because then he wouldn't be maximally great. That right?
Well, yeah, that's true. There's nothing that could be above him, but that's not what we're saying. We're saying that he has to be real. He can't be fake. Because if a maximally great God is fake, then
he's not maximally great.
He's not maximally great, because a maximally great God has to be real.
Okay.
So this priest, through modal logic, maybe not modal logic then, came up with this argument. And most theologians and philosophers, don't use this argument much, because obviously like it's so crazy. But I just thought it'd be an interesting one to share. But
yeah.
So God exists because if there's a possibility that maximally great being exists, he must exist, because in order to be maximally great, he would have to actually exist and not exist.
Okay, but that doesn't imply anything about benevolency.
It doesn't. Yeah. It don't like these arguments. I haven't done any arguments for benevolency or anything of that matter.
Okay.
All my arguments have just been to show that God exists.
Okay.
So maybe that would be an interesting topic to send. So like, why do people think that God is benevolent? Why do people think that God has certain qualities?
Yeah.
And the main reason is that if God created the universe and we were a byproduct of his creation, why would his creation become like have qualities that he didn't possess.
Okay. Okay.
Like to some extent, like obviously like we can build a computer that is like way different than us and has abilities that we don't possess.
Yeah.
But we still like moral reasons, like logical thinking, all this stuff. Like we live in a universe where human beings are capable of understanding the universe through mathematical formulas, and this is pretty incredible because if we were just a slightly bit dumber, or the universe was slightly more complicated, then we wouldn't be able to understand anything about a universe. So the creator of the universe so it follows that if he understood mathematics, understood those things, that and if there is good and if there is evil, then the creator of the universe must have certain qualities like that. Now, I'm not that familiar with this argument, so I might not be arguing this well, but that's essentially where you like derive certain attributes of God from. Is the idea that as his creation, we resemble God. We are like made in his image.
Okay. So, do you mind if I jump into like another thing real quick, or
Sure.
is there more you want to say on that? Okay. So this is something like I call it my modified version of Pascal's wager.
Oh yeah.
So.
Oh yes, Pascal's wager is awesome. That would be a good one to go over.
Okay, so let's first talk about Pascal's wager. So Pascal's wager is basically he's the guy who kind of said, okay, well, you know, if God like let's just say if God exists and he loves us and you believe in him, you go to heaven. Okay, that's just the if. So if he does exist and you believe that he does exist, then you'll get to go to heaven. Okay. If you don't believe he exists and he exists, then you wouldn't go to heaven. But if he did not exist and you believed in your life that he did exist, then it doesn't matter because you're dead anyways and you didn't realize you didn't go to heaven because you're dead. So the argument is you might as well believe in God because if he does exist, you'll go to heaven, and if he doesn't exist, then you wouldn't know that you didn't go to heaven. Mm-hmm. So it's a win-win for you. I mean, well, it's kind of like a win-neutral almost.
So like one conclusion is like if you believe in God, one conclusion is you just are annihilated. You cease to exist. So you lived a life believing in God.
Yeah.
And the other conclusion is God was real and you get to go to heaven.
Right.
But if you believe the counter thing, then if God isn't real, you're annihilated likewise. God is real, then you could be in trouble.
Yeah, so you get no benefit from not believing in God.
Yeah, and that's called Pascal's wager, by the way.
So this is my modified version of Pascal's wager, and not necessarily I follow this, but it's been very intriguing to me. Mm-hmm. Okay, so I actually think, heaven sounds great, but I actually think there's a much better reward, and that is the reward of thinking that heaven is there. So if you think, like, for example, like if imagine you like get home from work on a Friday night and you know like you're gonna go out with your friends and have a good time. The actual good time that you have is actually at work, because you think in the future and you're saying to yourself, oh, I'm looking forward to this. I'm gonna have a good time, and the whole preparation for it as well. It's just fun because you're thinking, yes, I'm gonna have a good time. Like I'm just in a good mood. Okay, so what I'm trying to argue is that if you believe that heaven exists and you're going there, what ends up happening is you are enjoying your life here more because you believe that you actually are going to heaven in the end.
So you're essentially making a psychological argument for a belief in God, because you're saying that an atheist point of view is very dim, like no purpose. We're just the small speck in an infinitesimal universe,
right?
That we have no meaning, no purpose, no morals, no ethics, nothing. And that's a pretty dim view of the world, and because you're living your life, you might as well reap the positive emotions that are felt from.
Yeah, and I would say it's not just heaven. There's many other things. Like, I would say prayer. I think prayer is really, in reality, is like a form of meditation that people don't even realize that they're doing. They think that they're praying, but yes, they may be praying, and maybe God is real and they're praying to him. But even if he was not, I think prayer is still psychologically beneficial for you, because it is like a form of meditation.
And you take your problems and you give them to someone else.
Yeah, and you give them and you vocalize them. And a problem vocalized is half solved because you're identifying it in real life. So I think there's many, and then also you have the benefit of believing that there's someone who always is there to care about you, no matter how bad the situation is. So I guess what I'm trying to say is there are so many psychological benefits from it that it perplexes me.
Let me give another example of this too. It perplexes me to why you would want to believe the alternative with Pascal's wager and with the psychological benefits of holding the position.
Yeah.
But then you'd have to ask, for one, like, what if holding the belief in God was not psychologically beneficial? Like, let's look at a scenario. Like, let's say that you live in a country that is very anti-religious, and if you were found out to pray to God, to sing, then you will be killed. So you're risking your survival in believing in God. And
Right.
that's like maybe the case of like
But maybe you would say to yourself, well, God wants me to lie so I can survive and spread his message or something like that. You know, I mean,
you could
so
rationalize
you could like, I mean, the problem is in that case you could use God to like excuse what you're doing. Like you'd be like,
Yeah.
well, God like told me to do this, and I mean, I don't want to say that people do that, but I guess there becomes a fine line. But what I'm trying to say is that having a belief in God, a benevolent God, I just don't see a very negative impact on you, even if he's not real. And I think a lot of people would say like, well, let's say you are convinced he's not real. Then what? I mean, you can't believe in him if you're convinced he's not real.
I think that you can't be convinced that he's not real. I mean, honestly, I think that in the scholarly level of research on this topic, like people have debated this for thousands of years, smart people on both sides.
Yeah.
And no one has came to, I mean, the only people that come to strong conclusions are dogmatic people that have an emotional reason for holding that view.
Right.
So the evidence is not conclusive either way.
Right. Well, let's suppose you're leaning more towards the side that God, a benevolent God, doesn't exist.
Mm-hmm.
I would say to them, this modified Pascal's wager, but I think the second thing I'd say, just for them to think about, is by your actions alone, you can change your beliefs. So, yes, your beliefs ultimately affect what actions that you do, but I would actually argue as well that your actions in turn affect your beliefs. It's a complete cycle. Mm-hmm. So by just doing the motions of believing there is a benevolent God, like praying every night, for example, I actually think you would start to believe in God. And I don't know, I can't prove it to you that this would happen,
right.
But I think it would actually change your belief to believe in God, which would then help you out psychologically.
And I think that too, like you could use this as an argument that the reason why there's a psychological benefit is because God must exist.
Oh wait,
yeah. But you then say like, well, there's all these other religions. Which religion is right? Like, but see, that's the thing is like people of all religions get psychological benefit. So does that point to even people who believe in multiple gods? But I've always thought that multiple religions points to the existence of God because, you know, how is it that we evolved with a need for God? Like, obviously you say, well, we don't know how this happened, so we must attribute it to something else.
Right.
But it's almost inherently in our nature to seek out God, and in all cultures, we seem to come to know a God in some form. And I don't think it necessarily follows from evolution that we would develop this mechanism. I think when you talk about evolutionary psychology and this whole idea like we need an answer for something, so we make God the answer, I think that's just totally speculative and just conjecture.
Well, I mean, I'm not quite sure. I don't know.
I don't know either, but that's just my opinion.
Yeah. Okay.
But yeah, I think a lot of religious people would be kind of appalled by the psychological Pascal's wager because they think that like, well, I mean, there's a lot of stuff you can do to reap psychological benefits. So I don't know. There's a lot of things you could say, but I think it's perfectly reasonable.
I think the reason why I would say this is to someone who wants to believe, who is kind of persuaded against believing in God, but I would offer it. I mean, I'm really not trying to degrade religion at all or any beliefs, but it's just something that I don't know. I kind of thought about it. I was like, you know, that's just very interesting just to observe that. And I'm not saying I practice that myself. I'm just saying it's just something interesting, like a theory that's interesting to observe.
Yeah. Totally. Well, I thought maybe we could before we end, like maybe jump into some interesting biblical stuff.
Okay.
So
cool, whatever. Yeah.
So some biblical debates, huh? Right. So one of my favorite biblical debates is the existence of hell.
Okay.
Okay. So I think that there is strong argument that hell does not exist from the Bible. So I think that the Bible points to annihilation for non-believers.
Okay.
And so do you know what annihilation is?
Yeah. So we gotta disclaimer. Okay. So I'm not really well versed in this area at all. So
don't worry.
So okay. So sorry. So okay. So basically, you're saying one version of hell, one interpretation of hell, was that everyone who was not believing in God would be annihilated.
Yeah, I think that this is a very reasonable position to hold because, I mean, I don't think it's necessarily fair for a God to punish people for eternity because of their choices.
Being in hell is worse. Being in hell internally is worse than being
far
annihilated.
Worse than being annihilated. I mean, like, we've all ceased to exist at one point. We can cease to exist again. It's not terrible, but it's definitely not going to heaven where we are internally happy, apparently.
Okay.
And so you say, like, why could you say that? Like, there's so many verses in the Bible that talk about hell and burn fires and stuff. Well, firstly, I'd say that people have priors, which a prior is basically like an emotional reason to hold a certain view, and through that emotional reason they interpret things a certain way.
Okay.
Many of the like different verses in the Bible that talk about fire and like brimstone and stuff are referring to literal fire and literal brimstone. So
Okay.
if you look at like there was a dump outside of Jerusalem. I can't tell you the name of it, that burned trash. And many times the Bible actually refers to this dump and not to not to hell actually, but many people think that the verse is referring to hell, but in fact it's referring to a dump that's outside Jerusalem where they burn trash.
Okay.
So firstly, I just showed that there's many examples that where it's already been misconstrued that it's talking about hell, but it's not. And then you have a verse that says like, or you shall surely perish.
Okay.
And perish is just another form of saying annihilation. Not you shall forever suffer in hell and burn in brimstone and fire and stuff. It says you will surely perish, and perish refers to annihilation. And that's one of the most famous verses. I'm trying to recall the whole thing.
Yeah. Okay, so this is I remember like when I was really young, I had to like memorize Bible verses and stuff. But when I was like really young, I thought of this ingenious theory and I was like, oh, I like know this stuff down pat. But I can't remember the verse. I think it's somewhere in Revelation. But it says something like there are certain events that would have to happen before the end, like before the
end
end
times, the apocalypse, yeah.
And it was like I don't know, certain storms had to happen or all these different criteria. But I just kind of came to the starting conclusion that the only way that all these criteria could be met is if everyone was dead. So I thought to myself, the only way that the end will actually happen is when there is no one to observe the end. So I was like, booyah! Like, look at that. So I have to wait. I have to worry about this for a while, guys. And then I grew up, but after that,
that's funny.
So anyways.
Well, I love the theory. So I just wanted to show that, like, I think that if you want to look it up more, there's a lot of like pretty strong arguments that hell is actually just annihilation. So sort of like with Christianity, there's a couple problems I do like struggle with. That I don't have answers to. So if you're a listener and you have answers to these, I would like to know.
Okay.
So this is my number one. This is the number one thing I've thought about that I don't understand. So in heaven, we're supposed to be eternally happy, right?
Yeah.
And on earth, we're supposed to bring as many people as we can to heaven so that they don't go to hell or are not annihilated, right? So let's say that you have a wife that you absolutely love.
Okay.
You love this wife so much. She's the world to you and stuff. And you're also a Christian. So when you die, you go to heaven.
Okay.
Well, you're up in heaven watching your wife down on earth, like if you can actually do that. And then your wife dies, but your wife never became a Christian, so she goes to hell. So how can you be eternally happy in heaven, knowing that the person that you love so much is in hell? And so I guess you offer theories like, well, God must like wipe your mind of your past events on earth or something, or
maybe she's not that important to you, but then you're like, well,
now she's no longer that important to you. Yeah, so it's like so that's sort of a dilemma. I don't know. I've thought of like other issues too, but the point being is that like I think that today, like in our society, there's a lot of religious dogma that's pushed by like the church, and I think when you look at it from like more of a scholarly perspective, like especially if you interpret it back in the Greek, then you start seeing that like a lot of like the things that society pushes on us are not really legitimate. Like, like there's this whole like the premarital sex argument, like where there's verses in the Bible that people interpret to mean that you can't have sex before marriage. But when you actually look at the language and the words used, it just I can't recall the word, but like it's just referring to
I think it's like a yoke. There was like a sorry. Yeah.
But it's just referring to immoral sexual behavior, society's immoral sexual behavior. It's not referring to specifically having sex before marriage. And it happened to be at that time that in society it was wrong to have sex before marriage. Why was it wrong to have sex before marriage? Because we didn't have contraceptives and birth control, and we couldn't prevent people from having children. So society makes a rule that you can't have sex before marriage so that you don't have a kid and get ostracized because you don't have a father to raise a kid.
Right. Another problem, back to the heaven theme that I had was, we talked about this earlier, like the relativity of things. So there's good weather would never exist without bad weather, right? In order for you to appreciate that there is good weather, you must have bad weather.
Yeah.
You must be able to at least picture
at
bad
least
weather.
on Earth, yeah, at least logically. Like, but what he's saying basically is that evil is a corruption of good.
Right.
But good is only is subjective and relative to the person experiencing it.
Yeah.
And without evil, then everything is just the same. Nothing is good.
So I want to extend that to heaven because they say like you're eternally happy.
Yeah.
Well, you can't really be happy and know that you're happy unless you've ever been sad before. And if you're eternally happy, then I think you wouldn't know what actually happiness is after a while, right? Because you had never been sad. So I don't know. That's just another thing.
Okay, so just like a quick
Rebuttal?
answer that I would like put together is that we currently are physical. We have physical bodies, and if God exists, we likely have spiritual bodies too. And so the physical body is where we experience happiness, pain, and pleasure. Like we feel happy because of dopamine production and stuff.
Right.
And so like when we start examining like an immaterial soul that goes to heaven, it's not determined by the brain chemistry, our brain chemistry, and the feelings that we have in our brain. So I think you can argue that potentially.
Okay.
I just like I think one last like relatively compelling argument for the existence of God would be the idea of dualism and some evidence that we have towards dualism. So dualism is basically the idea that like we have a soul and we have a brain, and the soul uses the brain as an instrument in order to interact in the world. So
orchestrate.
To orchestrate its goals and intentions.
Right.
So like let's say there's a pianist.
Okay.
A pianist plays a piano.
Right.
And
the piano serves as the instrument.
And it's the instrument to experience the world.
Yeah.
I have no idea what this is. But anyway, sorry.
Yes, sorry. Okay.
So let's say the piano is broken. Well, then you can't communicate. You can't communicate your music to the world. So let's say your brain like stops functioning. Well, you can't communicate to the world. And dualism would explain like why we feel like the same person at age 7 as we do as age 50, because we have entirely different parts to our brain. Yet there must be some commonality in terms of like the spiritual side. So what are the arguments for that? I guess like this argument I just find very compelling, but at the same time I could see in some ways some refutations to it in the fact that it's just like an n equals 1.
Oh,
I mean there's actually n equals like thousands, but like near death experiences.
Oh, okay.
So like when someone dies, they often experience this like crazy like out of the world like experience. So most of the ways that like scientific people explain this is saying like, well, their brain fires off is like it's malfunctioning and it fires off all these chemicals and hallucinations and stuff, and so they're just hallucinating before they die. And it's been pretty amazing. Like some of the near-death experiences are pretty amazing. Like people are able to know what's going on in a room that was a closed door, like in a house that was far away, like know specifically what's happening, like what was happening. And so you have like all these like really like mysterious like examples where people were able to do that. But I don't find that to be the most compelling evidence, because you could say they just got lucky. Like I could say Fidel Castro is brushing his teeth right now, and I could be right. And I could say a lot of stuff, and maybe only one thing sticks.
But the one thing just looks amazing that you guessed it right.
Yeah.
So
people focus on that. But the compelling argument was that there was actually a neuroscientist who was very much so a materialist. And a materialist is just someone that believes everything is comprised of material, and that there's no spiritual realm.
Right. Yeah.
Everything is just
it's like
material.
the opposite
The
of
physical
a dualist.
world is the only thing that exists. It's the opposite of a dualist.
Yeah.
So he was a big proponent of materialism, and he was even writing books about it and stuff. Well, anyway, he gets, I think, maybe in a car accident, and goes into a coma.
Okay.
The whole time he's in the coma, his brain is being monitored.
Yeah.
And the area of the brain that is responsible for any like the prefrontal cortex, I think it was, that's responsible for any imagery, anything that we see.
Oh, the occipital lobe in the back is also responsible for that
for
as well.
sight, like visual sight and stuff. Yeah. So basically, like his brain was being monitored this whole time.
Yeah.
Well, he woke up from the coma and he had these these crazy experiences where he went to a different world, and he said like that the experiences were far more vivid than even reality is. Like he could remember them more vividly, he could see them more vividly. But what was interesting about this case and different from the other cases was that his brain had been monitored the whole time, and there was like no activity in his brain. So before we explain these near-death experiences from like hallucinations and chemical reaction malfunctioning in the brain, well, this time there's no activity, and yet he has this whole entire like experience but this is a unique situation because it's like one of the first times that they've ever monitored a brain while someone was experiencing a near-death experience. So he had actually died. Actually, he experienced this whole thing when he had actually died. I'm sorry, he wasn't in a coma, but his heart stopped beating and he stopped breathing, but then he came back to life. But while that happened, his brain was being monitored the whole time.
Yeah, it's very rare to actually have someone's brain monitored during that scenario. Okay.
Exactly. So sorry, that was a big mistake. I didn't want to say he was in a coma. He actually died.
Okay.
And then came back to life. And while he had died, his brain had been monitored, and there was no activity. And so he came back, and now he is one of the forefronting speakers for dualism.
Huh, that's
Because
interesting.
so he realized he believes almost 100% based on a basic belief that that his experience was real, and we can somewhat use scientific knowledge like our brain monitoring to confirm what he's saying. Now, of course, this argument, like in some sense, is weak because we just have n equals 1.
Yeah.
But I think what we'll see over the next 10 years are more examples of this.
Yeah,
We'll be
our
able to
brain
compare more.
monitoring equipment is growing exponentially. Like
Yeah.
our ability, like we can now, the latest thing is we can now read words that you think.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it is growing exponentially. Yeah.
And so, so he believes in dualism now, which I think is a compelling argument. But I don't generally want to say the near death. I don't give much credit to near death experiences in general. But there's been pretty amazing stuff that comes from them, and I think that if we accept materialism, then we have to say that all of that stuff is lies. Anything that's mysterious that occurs is a lie, unless of course we accept quantum mechanics, which could say maybe it's probable, but something like that. But we have to say all that stuff's a lie. So why not just, when we take the position of maybe materialism is wrong and maybe dualism is true, then we can say that all of these experiences that have been compiled over centuries that cause people to believe in God after death actually could be real.
Maybe.
And depending on what, they might be real. And so depending on what our prior, before hearing about the event, that's how we evaluate it. So if we believe in God, then when we hear it, we think there could be validity to it. And likewise, when we hear about and we're a materialist, we just naturally assume it must be a chemical reaction. So it just brings up some interesting things, and maybe one day we'll do a podcast on dualism versus materialism and more arguments. Now, one last thing I want to add is that one of the leading figures in philosophy of the mind is Thomas Nagel.
Okay.
And I talked about Alvin Plantinga's evolutionary argument against naturalism.
Yeah.
Well, Thomas Nagel, in his most recent book, wrote about how it's an incredibly compelling argument, and he thinks that in the future we'll see people become dualist as a result.
Can we go over the argument or?
Oh no, that's the argument, evolutionary argument against naturalism. It's, he said if we're going to see people become dualists, we're going to see people drop naturalism and materialism and sort of thing.
Maybe.
And this is Thomas Nagel, who is not he is becoming I think he's now a theist because of these arguments. He has looked at the research and is changed. And you also see Anthony Flew, very dogmatic atheist, who up at the age of 80 began believing in God because he thought the arguments were more compelling for the belief in God. So you see this; those are two front runners in the scholarly field of philosophy. So,
that's good to know.
So that's kind of cool. So, so don't discredit belief in God just because you don't read any books or don't listen to the philosophers and stuff. Realize that there's strong arguments out there for both sides. Listen to both of them, and then come up with your own opinion. Thanks for listening.
All right, thanks guys. Stay tuned.